Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is pitching his strategy to combat rising gun violence in a meeting with federal and local leaders. He's encouraging cities and states to use funds from the COVID relief package to support law enforcement. Homicides in the U.S. are rising, but still remain below where they were in the mid-1990s. The president outlined the efforts to stem the flow of illegal firearms and stressed the need to provide local police departments with federal support.
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We know there are some things that work, and the first of those that works is stemming the flow of firearms used to commit violent crimes. It includes the Justice Department creating 5 new strike forces to crack down on illegal gun trafficking, and the Carters supplying weapons to cities of New York, from New York to the Bay Area. Secondly, is supporting local law enforcement with federal support they need. Our strategy provides including funding for law enforcement through the American Rescue Plan for states, cities, and to be able to hire police and pay them overtime in order to advance community policing.
Meanwhile, the Senate is back from its July 4th recess. The next 2 months will likely determine the fate of President Biden's jobs and families plans. Senators are hoping to vote on a bipartisan infrastructure bill later this month. That comes as Democrats continue to fight over the size of their single-party proposal. And 6 months after the January 6th attack, the last protective metal fencing put up around the Capitol has come down. In a statement, U.S. Capitol Police said, quote, "These changes were made based on the current threat environment and recent enhancements to the USCP's response capabilities." For more now, let's bring in Skyler Henry, Meridith McGraw, and Eli Stokols. Skyler is covering the White House for CBS News. Meridith is a national political correspondent for Politico. And Eli is a White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Welcome. It's good to see you all. Skyler, let me start with you. Who attended that White House meeting on crime reduction, and what were the main takeaways?
Well, perhaps most notably, Elaine, the perhaps next mayor of the city of New York, that's Eric Adams, the Brooklyn borough president. He, alongside D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, alongside San Jose's mayor, were involved in this meeting today. We also saw David Brown, the superintendent for the Chicago Police Department, as well as top cops from other agencies throughout the country, meet with the president. And what they talked about was ways to reduce this uptick in gun violence that we've been seeing this year. A new study shows that more than 10,000 people have died from gun violence just this year alone. It's a significant uptick from what we saw last year, certainly one that we saw from 2 years ago. And so now these officials are meeting with the president to talk about different ways to combat gun violence. And many of them have come out to say that there needs to be more of a holistic approach, if you will, not only addressing the issue of guns on the street. We know that the president has put out strike forces and talked about different ways to combat that as well, particularly as it pertains to ghost guns. But we also know that the Biden administration wants to create things like different summer jobs programs for youth who may be involved in situations that lead to violent crime. We also know that the administration is interested in creating community programs that would perhaps reduce the level of crime happening across the country, different ways than just throwing money at different departments across the country to try to tackle that problem. We know that certain agencies have a reduced number of police officers, particularly in, say, New York or Chicago. But the president and, quite frankly, officials feel that there needs to be more than just one way to address this problem. Eric Adams, he came out earlier today and he said other communities are waking up to an alarm clock, but communities of color are waking up to gunshots, to which the president responded, that is not good. And so we know that these officials are looking at different ways to try to tackle this problem. And might I add, this is not the first time that the president is doing so. Just a couple of weeks ago, he met with city and police officials from other parts of the country who are dealing with the same problem. We know that this is something that is a priority for the Biden administration. He's even going so far as suggesting that cities use some of that pandemic relief money in order to tackle this issue. It's just a matter of how and when they will implement some of those things.
Yeah, very quickly, Skyler, I just wonder about the political climate here in terms of actually getting some of these ideas done. I mean, is there a bipartisan appetite to get these kinds of programs enacted?
Well, if you remember back in March, there was at least a Democrat House passed bill that would at least have background checks on private gun sales. That was at least going to be the start in terms of some new reform in gun control legislation, perhaps even reducing violent crimes. But that has since stalled in the evenly divided Senate. And so we don't really know what is going to come from that. We know that this is something that is at the top of the Biden agenda in terms of dealing with this problem. Many city leaders feel as though, as I said before, there needs to be more than just trying to get guns off of the street and get, some of these bad actors in jail. There needs to be more efforts in communities, particularly communities of color, to try to reduce the problem.
All right. Meridith, on another topic here, now that the Senate is back in session, Majority Leader Schumer said they are getting closer to a bipartisan deal on infrastructure. How close exactly, and what about the Democratic division on their spending bill?
They're closer, but their work is still really cut out for them. They really have a lot to get done in the coming weeks if they want to pass a really ambitious infrastructure package. The broad brushstrokes here remains the same. Senator Schumer wants to pass a bipartisan bill on the floor, and that would deal with things like roads and bridges, and then also a budget resolution that would pass by reconciliation and have things like tax hikes for the rich and corporations, things that progressives and the party have really pushed for. But what's still unclear is how much support he will find from Republicans. They'll need 10 Republicans to help pass this. And while 10 did support it initially, we don't know how they would feel about whatever legislation moves forward. And then, of course, whatever's pushed forward with the reconciliation package that some in the party say is still too low. People like Senator Bernie Sanders, who are pushing for as much as $6 trillion for a more left-leaning bill. So they have their work cut out for them. We still don't know also if McConnell's going to support this. He said that he's going to pull up a hell of a fight here. So it's really going to be a great test of negotiation skills if they can pull this off. And we're expected to see movement on this as soon as next week.
All right, well, let's turn to the pandemic. Eli, President Biden offered to go door to door to help encourage vaccination since the overwhelming majority of new COVID deaths are among the unvaccinated. How is this being framed by Republicans?
Well, I mean, that's the problem for this White House, is that the framing of masks and vaccines totally depends on your partisan identification, your party affiliation. And so the White House has been unable to reach a lot of, self-identified Republicans, Trump voters, people who have gotten a lot of messaging from conservative media outlets and decided that they are not getting the vaccine, that this is sort of an assault on their freedom, their healthcare choice. Some have even used that word. And it's been very difficult for the White House to sort of make further inroads. They're close to the 70% goal of vaccinated adults in the country, but getting too far beyond that is a real challenge. They recognize that the president going door to door, while that's a nice talking point, probably not going to happen. And they recognize that he is probably not the best person to reach the people who are really resistant to getting this. But at this point, given that they've been getting this messaging for months now, their opposition to the vaccine and to what this administration is urging them to do, it's hardened a great deal. And that is the problem. That is why you're seeing the numbers skyrocket, specifically in certain geographical areas, redder parts of the country. But it's a real problem for the White House, and I'm not sure they really have a handle on it at this point.
Yeah, we've heard from Dr. Anthony Fauci talking about how at this point it's not federal officials who are sort of the trusted messengers, at least according to some populations, but it's those local physicians, those clergymen and women who they have seen some success with in reaching those who may be skeptical about getting a vaccine. Skyler, let me ask you about this House panel to investigate the Capitol riot. It is set to hold its first hearing sometime this week. Is it clear whether Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy will work with Speaker Nancy Pelosi to appoint any Republicans to serve on it?
Well, it's unclear up until this point, right? We know that he certainly has a big task if he is going to try to appoint someone to serve here. If he chooses not to, remember, he doesn't have to, then that leaves the hole for Republicans, if you will, for Democrats to control the narrative. We know that this is something that they have leaned on this entire time, of saying that the president, or the former president, has been responsible for what happened on January 6th this entire time. We know that House Republicans have looked, majority of them, I should say, have looked to move past this issue. And really, you could say the same thing for the Senate as well. More than likely focused on next year's midterm elections and worried about what talking and having this committee sort of existing in the background would do to their chances to gain more seats in the House and perhaps in the Senate as well. But we know that if they move forward without any sort of Republican representation, then that is certainly going to lean more in the Democratic favor, not to mention the fact that Congresswoman Liz Cheney, someone who is unabashedly not opposed to walking out of lockstep with her Republican colleagues in terms of this particular issue, is also serving on this committee on the Democratic side, so to speak. And so it's important for him to have some sort of representation. Also talking about who is savvy enough to be able to be on this committee as well. We know that there are going to be some folks, some shrewd folks, some of which served on these impeachment panels in the past, that are going to participate on these committees, on this committee. And so he certainly has a tough task, Minority Leader McCarthy does, in terms of naming somebody to this. It remains to be seen, though, who is actually going to be put on the panel.
Meridith, former President Trump headlined the annual Conservative Political Action Conference in Dallas on Sunday. Here's what he said about the Capitol rioters during an interview with Fox News ahead of his keynote speech. And a warning, the video on the right side of the screen showing Ashley Babbitt's final moments may be hard to watch.
By the way, while you're at it, who shot Ashley Babbitt? Why are they keeping that secret? Who was the person that shot an innocent, wonderful, incredible woman, a military woman, right in the head, and there's no repercussions? If that were on the other side, it would be the biggest story in this country. Who shot Ashley Babbitt? People want to know. And they were peaceful people. These were great people. The crowd was unbelievable. And I mentioned the word love, the love in the air. I've never seen anything like it.
Now, Ashley Babbitt was shot and killed by Capitol Police as she appeared to be breaking into the Speaker's lobby outside the House chamber as members of Congress were being evacuated for their safety. Meridith, is the former president's refusal to condemn violence and actually praise the apparent perpetrators problematic for any January 6th investigation?
Well, we just heard Skyler talking about this commission and how Republicans are reluctant to join it. A lot of Republicans see this investigation into January 6th as a way to condemn former President Trump and to criticize him. And yet, as you just heard in that clip from Fox News, the former president is making a martyr out of Ashley Babbitt, an Air Force vet who was also a QAnon follower, who believed the election was stolen so fervently that she marched to the Capitol and joined in on those riots. And he called those people who went up there, quote, great people. So what you're seeing, at least from Trump, is an effort to change the narrative on January 6th and what happened there. I can imagine a lot of Republicans aren't going to like to hear it characterized that way, but it's something that was repeated at CPAC. Louis Gohmert, a congressman who is part of the, I would say, the more extreme side of the party, pushed conspiracy theories that Democrats were somehow behind all of this. So there is going to be an effort to sort of flip things on its head. And it will be interesting to see how the Republicans that are appointed to this committee deal with some of the comments that the former president is now making about what objectively was a really horrific moment in American history.
Right, because we know so much of the Republican base is with President Trump on many of the baseless claims that he has made up until this point. Eli, in a special legislative session, Texas Republicans voted to advance legislation that, if passed, would ban drive-through voting and 24-hour voting. In response, Democrats are planning a second walkout to stop it from moving forward. What is the White House's plan to combat these state-level restrictions?
Well, for now, the plan is for the president to go to Philadelphia on Tuesday and deliver a speech saying that, calling out these Republican restrictive voter laws as authoritarian, the press secretary said today, and as, to use her words again, the biggest threat to American democracy since the Civil War. That's pretty intense rhetoric, and the president will probably also point out that a lot of these laws, the pretext for them is the big lie, the gaslighting that we're hearing from President Trump and other Republicans about January 6th, and going back to the election and the bogus claims that the election was somehow stolen, that there was somehow fraud. Biden will point out what the White House calls the irony of the fact that not only is that not true, this was, the White House says, the safest and least fraudulent election and the biggest turnout in American history. But beyond the speech on Tuesday, the White House does not have any plan, at least that it is showing thus far. They say they're going to use the bully pulpit. They're going to educate voters with an eye on 2022 and the midterm elections. And if there are more restrictive laws in place in certain states, they want to make sure that their get out the vote efforts inform voters of the things that have changed and make sure that people vote, and that the Democratic base is galvanized by this and motivated to turn out, not frustrated that the White House and Congress have not come up with some sort of legislative response, which is a problem for the White House because given the votes, the narrow majorities in the Senate, the president's stated aversion to changing the filibuster rule and the lack of votes in the Senate to do so. They don't have all 50 Democrats in place to do that. There is no legislative response. There is no federal legislation coming. And I think, the White House is trying to fight to manage this, to talk about this, to make sure that people understand that Republicans are doing this on the pretext of a false claim about the election and making it harder for people to vote as a result. And making the country less democratic, but actually tangibly enacting laws to, roll back some of these Republican reforms. That does not seem to be in the offing at this point. And that's a real point of frustration for a lot of activists on the left. Some understand that the president has limited moves here. You can't just, as the press secretary says, wave a magic wand and change the laws. You need 60 votes in the Senate, and they don't have anywhere close. But this is going to be a tough issue for them going forward, and how they manage it may have a lot to do with what happens next fall and whether Democrats are depressed or whether they're animated and galvanized to turn out.
Yeah, something that we are likely going to hear a lot more about here in the months ahead. Finally, Skyler, you have been following the administration's response to the assassination of Haiti's president. What is the latest on that?
Right. Well, we heard from the president earlier today, just before his meeting with those law enforcement and city officials, talking about gun violence, about Haiti and Cuba even. But he said that he sent down a high-level delegation down to Haiti to try to assess the situation, to see what's been going on diplomatically ever since that assassination. We know that most of them have returned back to D.C. to report back to the president, although it's unclear, and we've reached out to Press Secretary Jen Psaki on this issue just to make sure. But if there were any other members of the delegation who perhaps stayed in Haiti for another day to see what's going on there. But the president said that the people of Haiti deserve peace and security, and leaders need to come together for the good of the country. Now, as for what that means, that is, relatively unclear. Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that most of that is going to be left up to the Haitian people. She was asked earlier today during the briefing whether the U.S. would send some sort of troop or army or soldiers or someone down to Haiti to be able to try to control the diplomatic situation in the interim while they try to figure out what's happening down there. Psaki said that was going to primarily be left up to the Haitian people to decide how they want to move forward, and the White House and the Biden administration as a whole is still assessing the situation.
All right. Well, Skyler Henry, Meridith McGraw, and Eli Stokols, thank you all very much.